Well, rapid growth in the Asia-Pacific region is sparking huge infrastructure projects, and to facilitate these, many countries are turning to private-public partnerships. Global advisory firm KPMG says infrastructure investment should grow to around $2.5 trillion over the next 5 years. For example, India has recently flagged a new program that could see its growing currency reserves used to finance local infrastructure projects. It's anticipated that it will need more than $3 billion worth of new infrastructure in 5 years to accommodate its growing economy. And it's this type of demand that can provide tremendous opportunities for countries in the region, particularly Australia. Joining me to talk about just how business can benefit is Graham Brooke, who's a partner at KPMG. Graham Brooke, for those who don't know, how do PPPs work?
Okay, well, PPPs are just take the form of a contract between the public sector, the government, and a private sector consortium. The contract in its nature is generally long-term, so a period of between 25 or 30 years in term. There's no payment from the government to the private sector until the asset is fully functioning. So if you look at, for example, a school or a prison or a hospital, the private sector would design and build and operate the school. There'd be no payment from the government to the private sector until the facility was fully operational. And the difference between a PPP and a simple outsourcing contract is that the PPP contract generally involves a significant asset, such as the hospital, prison or school, and the private sector is taking significant risk associated with the management of that asset, and it's paid for through a kind of rental payment, or the payment takes the form of a rental payment from the date the facility is operational until the date it's handed back to the public sector.
So how can these joint agreements be used to benefit all parties?
Well, from the government's perspective, it's proven to be a very efficient way of receiving facilities on time. So hospitals, prisons, schools, etc. are delivered on time. They're delivered on budget because the private sector is financially incentivized to do so. So the government gets its infrastructure in the way that it wants it. The users of the service, the patients in the hospital and the pupils in the school, they receive better quality services. They receive new buildings which are well maintained. The employees, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, they're able to work in better quality facilities. And in terms of investors, the investors are able to access a long-term income stream, and that's proving to be very useful for such as the superannuation funds.
Okay, so Graham Brooke, is India an example of an economy which admits it can't reach infrastructure targets without private funding?
India is a very good example. India has a requirement, if you look at the ADB norms for infrastructure requirements, which says that a country should be spending around 6% of its GDP on infrastructure. That means that a country such as India would need to spend something like $400 billion over the next 5 years on its infrastructure. There's no lack of money to do that, but if it doesn't deliver that infrastructure efficiently and on time and on budget, then that could have serious implications for the growth rate of somewhere like India. So very important for a country that's growing fast. The infrastructure needs to keep up with that growth, and PPP is a very efficient mechanism for making sure that the infrastructure money is well spent, facilities are delivered on time and on budget.
Okay, obviously India is a very good example of this, but what other nations are set to benefit most from the need for investment?
Well, within the Asia-Pacific region, of course, we have very fast-growing economies. If you look at China, for example, we estimate that China has a requirement for $1.3 trillion worth of infrastructure investment over the next 5 years. If you look at the last quarter, China's economy has been growing at 11.1%. In order to maintain that kind of growth, it needs desperately to spend money on infrastructure and to spend that money well. But it's not just China and India, they're the standouts, but it's also the likes of South Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore. So almost every country in the region is affected and has a requirement to spend money effectively.
Okay, so there's a huge appetite for infrastructure growth out there in the region, but what about risks such as corruption in emerging economies? Is that a deterrent?
There are lots of risks for any foreign investor investing in countries in the region. There's the currency risk, of course. There's the sovereignty risk around countries, and there is the risk of corruption. PPP fits very neatly into that and adds a new tool for governments. PPPs generally follow a very well documented process. The opportunity for corruption is much reduced. So what we're finding is that PPPs are a very useful tool and help in the fight for corruption. It also actually reduces the direct link between governments and major contractors by having advisors and the investment banks in between.
Okay, Graham Brook, I'd like to move on to another point. In Australia, we've seen a number of failed PPPs, like the Cross-City Tunnel, which went into receivership earlier. Investors like Hong Kong's Cheung Kong Infrastructure, they lost much of their investment. Do you think this is a concern?
Yes, it is a concern. I don't think there have been many failures in actual fact. I think the Cross-City Tunnel is a tremendous piece of infrastructure. I used it this morning and managed to avoid 15 sets of traffic lights by doing so. It was a very good example of where the government transferred significant risk to the private sector. The private sector got it. Having said that, there are currently $10 billion worth of projects happening in Australia at the current time. There's no shortage of bidders or investors willing to invest in these projects. We're also finding the same in reverse. So the latest deal in Asia was the National University of Singapore PPP deal. 5 bidders, 4 of whom were Australian. So we are finding that there's no lack of appetite despite 1 or 2 hiccups, as you mentioned.
All right, Graham Brook, we'll have to leave it there for today, but thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you.